Hey, what's
guys,
going on, folks?
it is
Ready.
Scotchford on my Thursday night.
There we go.
Yes.
There we go.
Made it just in time.
Cheers to that.
Cheers, boys.
Cheers. What do we got in the glass?
This.
Whatever you gave me.
Black Bowl.
I have a little Glenmorangie Star in mine.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Dr. Scotch is with us
You
tonight.
chose
Hey, guys.
correctly.
Dr. Scotch here. I've got Andrew's thing in front of me, but that's all right. It's kind of part of the
The
setup.
doc is in the house.
Guess we need
Dr.
another one.
Scotch, Whiskey 201 tonight.
Oh, yeah, we must
Alright.
be talking about something we need his intelligence for.
Well, when I looked at the agenda for the show tonight, I even said, "I'm like, gosh, I hope Dr. Scotch is coming because this is a deep one.
It is.
This is a lot to talk about tonight."
It's 200 level deep. We could get 400 level deep with Dr. Scotch and get into all kinds of
Yeah,
chemical
that's
bonds
true.
and
We
shit,
we,
and that
we
blows
could talk
up.
about the actual cycle of the yeast breaking the glucose down into the individual alcohol component.
I was waiting for where water comes from. Let's do the water cycle.
Well, yeah, we could, yeah, Whiskey 201, the water cycle.
It runs through the peat bog, and then
Oh, my God.
then it ends up at Lagavulin
gosh.
or wherever.
But to continue the educational theme, if
Yes.
you will, right? We've got this, a 101, 201, kind of like a college course moniker going on, right? And obviously the 100s or the entry level.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the basics of Scotch, right? So what did we do last week? What was it? I don't even remember.
It was your episode.
I know, and I don't even
the
remember.
categories of Scotch.
Oh,
You
right,
put
so
me
the
on
5 categories.
put me in the hot seat and I failed.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, the
you
malt,
did.
single malt,
Gosh,
blended
I did
malt,
okay.
blended
It's like
this. Yeah.
sometimes, Drew, you got to sit back on those curveballs, man. Just sit back.
That's
on
all
it.
right. I'll take it like a champ. Hey, thanks for the super chat, Zach Andrews. Just want to
Zach,
call it
thank
out.
you very much.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Oh,
Cheers
Molly.
to that, man.
Oh, look at Molly on that.
Great mouth malt.
Cool. Good to
So
see ya.
that was a 100 level, right? It was basic, and this week we're taking it a little bit deeper and getting a little bit more complex of a topic, and we've got more on the slate to get even deeper. But this was a really good conversation, and it's a lot to do with not just Scotch, but even all whiskey.
It's really all whiskeys. I mean,
Right.
we'll kind of focus on Scotch to some extent, but the topic's barley.
Right.
And every whiskey has barley in it. Now, how much you have, that depends on where you are and what you're doing.
What
But
kind, how much, what you've done to it before you use it, type of stuff, and that's all part of the conversation.
it's all part of the
tonight. So-
conversation. Can you pull up our...
Oh, do you need your agenda?
I need my agenda because, number one, for timing. Oh, it's out here. Number two, I don't have great non-photographic memory. So we're going to start out kind of talking through some barley basics, going through some history of this, how peated barley affects things. We'll go into some things about, Irish versus Scotch and kind of how they do barley. And then we'll kind of wrap it up and talk through that. So, and basically see why barley is really important for whiskey, but the types of barley, we may need a 301 on those types of barley to kind of go into any nuance there. So
There's a lot.
yes, and we will have questions at the end. If you don't run out of time, we'll have time for some questions
Yes.
at the end. So
If,
please,
if you have a question, make sure you put Q : in front so we know we can search for. We can filter through comments now. It makes it easier
that's
for
great.
us.
Cool.
Yes. So,
all right.
so this is going to be interesting, but
I was-
a fairly long one.
I was just sitting here wondering how deep we were going to go. I'm like, I wonder if we're going to go back to like the Fertile Crescent, and then it's
First thing.
it's the
bullet
first
point.
bullet.
It's a bullet point, and dun dun dun.
So segment one is barley basics. So we're going to talk a little bit about barley in general, and the way I sum up barley is it's grass with big seeds. That's really what it is.
yeah.
Grass
That's what it
with
always
big
was.
seeds.
It first came out or the best record we have of it is seeing some barley ground or barley stones. I think grinding stones about 23,000 years ago. But there's a lot of gap in there. And
So what would they have been doing with it 23,000 years ago?
making bread out of it, making bread
Making bread out
or
of it.
paste or whatever, tortillas or
Just
what.
set the old oven at 350 and
Unleavened bread.
unleavened
Yeah.
bread. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, essentially, probably back then. I mean, they
Or
did.
wild
I don't
yeast,
know if they were
maybe.
baking yet, but you could still make a porridge or something out of it for sure. Grind it up and make a porridge out of it.
Okay. All right.
And the beauty of it is really adaptable. So the first ones were in the Fertile Crescent, like I said, in the I think of it in like Iraq, where you had the Tigris and the Euphrates River. There's a fertile zone between there. That's probably where it initially started. And then it just spread. And the beauty of barley is it's so adaptable. It's a little bit of breeding and cross pollination, and you can run it all the way from Scotland and Minnesota down through into almost arid regions. It's really adaptable grain.
All right.
There you go.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Now, one of the things that is a very common discussion about barley is 2-row or 6-row barley. And you think, oh, well, 2-row. So when they plant those, they do 2 rows at a time. And when they plant 6-row, they plant 6 rows of barley at a time. It has nothing to do with the way they plant it. And I used to think that for a long time. The 2-row barley,
the actual seed.
Yeah, it's the actual grain bundle at the top. So with barley, all those seed bundles, with all barley, there are 6 flowers per row on that flower. So you think of the stem, it flowers six flowers around, going all the way down that top of that stem. Well, with 2-row barley, only 2 of those 6 flowers are fertile. Only 2 of those will actually make grain. I don't know why it's done that. It's an intentional mutation that humans have put into it. Whereas 6-row barley, all 6 of those flowers are fertile, so all 6 will produce grain. And so when you actually look at the head of the barley, once it's matured, you'll have either 2 rows or you have 6 rows of seeds.
So is this one of those instances where size matters? Or?
It does, because the 2-row makes larger, rounder seeds.
It's all about the starch content.
Hold on to your seats. So 6-row and 2-row. So you're saying basically 2-row gives them more room to grow bigger?
It does. And it allows the energy of the plant to focus on only 2 of the rows.
So they're not fighting for space like a tree if you get too close together.
It's almost like pruning a plant. You prune something so that more nutrients go to certain fruit.
That's exactly right.
So, and I may be getting ahead of ourselves, but you're saying because they're bigger, it actually is better for whiskey making in general?
Well, it's better. It's better for handling. It's better for whiskey. It's maybe not as good for animal grain and animal feed, because roughly 70% of the barley grown in the world goes to animal feed because it's got a high protein content. It grows everywhere. So every country can grow barley. So it's great for animal grain. Whereas like corn, you can't grow in northern climates, and wheat has certain limits, and rice is definitely limited, but barley grows everywhere. So they use it for feed everywhere.
There you go.
So that's one thing that's unique about that. The 6-row, the beauty of 6-row is it's got smaller hulls, so there's less indigestible fiber and stuff in it. Whereas the 2-row, it's a bigger grain, it's got a thicker hull, which is important for whiskey making, actually, quite honestly. We'll talk about that a little bit later.
Okay.
Yep. So interesting.
Do they still grow this 2 versus 6 as far as speed of growing change at all? Does 6 grow faster than a 2-row?
Well, yes, there is. I don't remember the unique, because there typically with barley there's like a spring barley and a fall barley, and the spring barley is most common because it allows for a fairly short growing window. Like in Scotland, UK, Minnesota, Canada, they would essentially do 1 crop a year. They can only have enough growth window, but in more areas with a longer growing season, you can actually get a spring and a fall crop out of barley, because it takes about 90 days, give or take, for some of them.
So the spring barley is not about moving it forward in an hour, or
no, and then fall barley is back an hour. Yeah.
So
there's some difference in growth. There are some really fast growing ones, and there are some other ones that are bigger.
Can we get rid of that stupid thing?
I can't help it, man.
That. Yeah.
Sorry, you got ADHD distraction over there going on. So, so what's the next topic?
Let's scroll down a little bit. Let's go on to the next, or get in the next thing. So, so part of the reason barley is so important is because, important for whiskey, is essentially what it does is it allows the conversion of starches to sugars in really all whiskey produced and in all beer making and all those kind of things. You can use other grains in beer, you can use other grains in whiskey, but they don't malt as well. And so if they don't malt as well, they don't produce the enzyme that converts the starch to sugar.
What's that?
What's malting?
Yeah, man.
Well, do we talk about it later? I don't think we talk about it later.
I don't want to skip ahead, but I mean...
let me have the thing. Let me look at my notes, because we are bouncing around, which is great. I think we need to do that. All right, so we're not going to talk about that. So malting. So essentially, what malting is we're going to talk about that.
Malted versus not
Yeah, we'll
malted.
talk about that in a later segment about what malting is. But what we want to talk about here is
I've already got it all figured out.
you've already got it.
Yeah, man.
Oh, man, he's already got it. Okay. So that malt whiskey is important for the enzyme for converting converting starches to sugars, and then you can use other grains to produce additional starches, but the enzymes from the malted barley. So typically you'll have 30 plus % of your grain will be malted barley to provide enough enzymes to convert all the starches.
And essentially, it's basically taking the barley, soaking the shit out of it in water for a while, letting it germinate just a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Tiny bit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You essentially you soak the grain and then you essentially let the water drain out.
And then you
And
dry
then
it.
you got to do that a few times to get. Essentially, you
Oh.
want to soften the hull and let water get into the seed so it can then germinate. And then once it's just started to germinate, you dry it out.
Gotcha.
And you can use heat or you can use peat.
There's
and
some
we'll talk
bad
about
jokes
that later.
there too.
There's lots of other things, but you said malting, so I want to make sure we're
Yeah.
clear on that. So, but your point was when you go back, you're saying it's important to whiskey making because it was one of the most efficient ways to kind of get to that point.
Exactly.
Sugar.
It gets you to sugar faster, and maybe arguably more important, it increases your yield. So if you use just grain without malting it, yeast will be able to convert there are some sugars into any grain.
Right, and
But
that's
it
kind
just-
of a more popular thing in Irish whiskey, isn't it? They do
use unmalted barley. Yeah.
unmalted
yeah.
barley. Yeah.
True, triple distilled too, but yes.
Yeah, the unmalted
Interesting.
barley is a source of the starches, but the malted barley gives you the enzymes to do it. But either way, even if you don't do any malting, yeast will be able to create some alcohol out of all grains. It's just significantly reduced. So that's something to consider.
Huh.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, so you've malted this stuff and you dried
We
it
got
out.
barley.
And now we're backing up to where we were when we're talking about.
Varieties. So we're going next up. What's our time? Close enough.
Yeah, we're good.
We're going to get
Right, we're
into barley varieties. So there are a couple of major varieties that occur. There are some of the early varieties were basically, a farmer was just crossbreeding with other varieties of barley. It was a piece of grass, and it had a few little grains on the top, and they were really small, and they tended to shatter when you started to harvest it. They would like all fly apart, which was a problem because it would like scatter over the ground, and you couldn't like collect it and gather it as well. So farmers would go through and they would find ones that didn't like fall apart when you harvested, and they would have found ones with thicker hulls and things like that. And eventually, through selective breeding, they've done a lot to create more efficient barley production, so they can get more yield per acre, and then you can get more alcohol yield per ton of grain through all the selective breeding. They really haven't done a whole lot of like genetically modifying it. It's one.
You would think they would by now, but
Yeah,
I guess the thing is what's the
it's-
point if it's already working?
If it's already growing well, then there's no reason.
Right.
To put
I
a
just
lot of
can't
effort
imagine
into
that
it.
humans haven't gotten a hold of it and genetically
Well,
modified it like they have everything
in
else.
the future of barley, we'll get into that. They are doing some of that now for sure.
What
Yeah.
about that? What was that one ship that crashed a long time ago and they found the wreckage and they reproduced the whiskey?
Shackleton.
The Shackleton. Did they do anything on the barley in that one, or was it just reproducing? Because I know there
No, they
was some
just
kind
found
of
the whiskey.
DNA there.
Yeah,
a little bit,
they
wasn't it?
just got the flavor profile.
Okay.
Essentially.
They didn't find the same barley and the same yeast and all that. They didn't go to that extent.
Yeah, that's correct.
So basically, what you're telling me is the variety is that back in the day they just figured out the flavor profiles based off of them, and that says here varieties like Marius Otter, Golden Promise, and they gained some reputation basically back then to kind of figure out which ones are good to combine.
Yeah, a lot of those, the Golden Promise and Optima and
Optic.
Optic, yeah.
Optic, yeah.
Those were essentially bred for yield. Those really were
Mass.
yield. They weren't as much for flavor. There's a little bit of work with flavor, but mostly it's for yield, yield of growing and yield of alcohol from that grain.
Okay.
Yeah. There was also a lot of hybridization for disease resistance. There's something called smut that grows, fungus that grows on.
You dirty barley.
That grows on.
Dirty
barley.
Because you have such a variety of environments, every environment needs a kind of a different resistance. So for different bacteria and things. So
I could just see those Scottish farmers. I saw you drill with your smut. You know,
You're reading the smut book again, aren't you, Barley 101?
Whatever.
See, and one of the things that also is grown that they've bred for is hull. So around each grain on the stem, there's a hull that goes around it, and that hull is actually really important for a couple reasons. If you're growing it for animal feed, the hull is wasted energy because the hull is indigestible to an animal, so it's not important. But the hull is really important for whiskey production because that hull is what kind of slows down and manages the sprouting during the malting
Kind of
process.
like an egg layer in a sense, right? As far as keeping it contained so that it has to break out of it.
Exactly. That hull is what makes malted barley so easy to produce. It's because that holds it together as the little roots come out. It doesn't crack open like a corn or a wheat or another fruit. So it starts to germinate, and then you can stop it, and you can still have a grain that's easy to move and transport and ship and all this kind of thing.
Open.
If you malt corn, it almost turns to mush, and so it does. It's just then you're moving wet flour. It just doesn't work as well. So that hull is really beneficial to that. Did you have that too?
No, I was talking about.
Oh, okay. So that's an important it's an important thing for that grain. So they've done that. Now, I don't know if you've ever had beef barley soup.
I
I have not.
I love beef barley soup. It's one of the things I grew up with, and that is essentially the same kind of barley, except they've processed it. You know, they haven't ground it, but they've peeled the hull off, and they peeled away some of the endosperm and all the other parts that are in there, and it essentially creates a barley that is more easy. It's easier to eat, and you put it in soup, and it expands just like rice does, and it just adds kind of a nutty flavor to a soup or
really?
stew. So you can find pearl barley in any grocery store as well.
I've
not very
never
common.
heard of that.
It's not
Pearl
very
barley?
common, but yeah, I enjoy it. It's
Okay.
beef barley
Yeah.
soup is one of my favorites.
I make it occasionally.
And you can grind it. You can make like a gruel out of it. In fact, that's one of the things in old, Oliver Twist UK days. You'd feed the workhouse people gruel, which is essentially ground barley made into a porridge, essentially a really thin porridge, typically. So humans can eat it. They do eat it. They more often drink it in either a beer or whiskey, though.
The correct way.
I like to drink it.
Yeah.
Who doesn't like gruel?
Now, so the interesting thing is,
We should have a little gruel night. Gruel night in Scotch.
yeah, we've
Sounds
had
better than smut.
we've had marzipan, so let's have some gruel.
This will not be as good.
Yeah, no kidding. So one of the things that with all the advances in barley production, there hasn't been a lot of work done on the flavor profile of the barley that you produce. Now, I did read an article today from one of the guys from Westland, and they've done a lot of work with different barleys to try and pull the flavor out. And he's convinced that there is significant flavor differences between the different strains of barley. But when you're producing 20 million liters of whiskey a year, and you got to be consistent with your cuts, and you got to just crank it, you don't really have time to worry about that. You want to get the same grain every day, and you want to run it the same. So craft distilleries and craft breweries do a lot with barley. They do different types of roastings, and they do all those kind of things that you can really pull out of it. But for mass-produced people, maybe not as important. It would be interesting to do some work on that. That may be like a Whiskey 301 is flavor influence on whiskey.
Oh my gosh, that could get super deep.
So
it could get deep.
But what I hear though is the changes of the variety of barley over time then have not really been. Those changes aren't influenced by flavor, but by yield, probably.
Primarily yield.
That's it.
Yeah, the Scotch Whisky Association has certain specific grains that they recommend. There's like 10 different varieties of barley that they recommend, and they've all been produced for certain reasons, and we'll talk about that in a later episode or later portion of the show. But their primary influence is alcohol content and that kind of thing. So
Here's a left field question for you. Interesting point, but how much are they really still getting locally versus just buying it now?
We do go to that in a little bit. We'll
I
cover
think that's
that.
an eye-opener question.
It kind of is.
We'll cover that in segment 5.
I can tell you from a commercial standpoint, the distiller may want to have like weird heirloom varieties of barley, but if there's not a farmer that can plant it in a commercially viable way, and if you can't get seed for it, that's too bad.
Yeah. Not only that, but think about the risk on it. So you find a farmer that says, yeah, all right, I'll plant that special whacked out barley that you want, and but I'm going to need the money up front to do it, right?
Well, most of it's contract grown.
It is.
But then guess what? Shitty season, drought. Too
What
much
happens
rain.
every year?
Smut.
Yep.
Because the smut is
Smut is
I would
killing your
think,
barley.
like some of the farm to bottle distilleries would
Sure.
be able to mess around with that a little bit more.
Yeah, they do.
But you're talking really small batches.
It is small batches, and you're right. They do contract up front, saying that, all right, I farmer X, I want you to grow this variety of barley. I will pay you this much for your farming expenses, and you give me the grain, no matter how much grain you get. And so the farmer says, all right, and that way, if it's a bad year, the farmer's guaranteed income.
Right.
He's got a safe bet, and the guy gets the grain and whatever.
But it's a gamble on the distillery.
Oh, absolutely. The gamble is all in the distillery.
They're taking the risk.
A
right?
barley farmer can make thousands of acres of, Optic or whatever the common brand is, whatever brewers are using, and they can guarantee their income. So they need essentially you're asking for craft farming too, which is more difficult.
Sure.
Yeah.
Who wrote this?
Yep.
So I guess the point I was kind of going towards too about that is, realistically, hundreds of years ago, growing crops was a pretty big deal, and it still is today. But I think about just what we see in I wouldn't say we're rural, but things change. Like farmers lose. You mentioned about how everything happens, right? So like you're in Scotland, and that's a major source of your whiskey. Like at some point, that farm that was down the street or whatever may not be there anymore.
Turned into a mall.
Exactly, it turned into a mall. So there's got to be like some kind of backup plan, and that's why I was kind of getting to. And it wasn't. These are the things you don't think about when you just consume whiskey off the shelf. Like, oh, it's a great bottle, but there's a lot of work that goes into this.
Well, where did the ingredients?
Well, we can talk through that right now.
Okay.
We've got it's one of our segments, but we just could roll right into this one. So, producers of barley in the world. So there are about 145 million tons of barley produced in 2021.
145 million tons.
Of that, 13% was in Russia.
Wow,
I've heard
Russia.
that. I've heard Russia produces a lot of barley.
Eastern Europe is, and some of Western Europe is your source of barley for the world. Between Russia, France, Germany, Ukraine, Spain,
Wow.
It's really Europe.
That's eye-opening, actually.
So United Kingdom doesn't even come in until number 7th.
Keep going down.
So you got Canada as 8. Turkey has a bunch.
Which is right there.
That's a Fertile Crescent.
Yeah.
Argentina, Poland, Denmark, Iran has 2 million. The United States doesn't come in until 15th. So of all the beer,
we got opportunity.
all
Wait a
the
minute.
beer that's brewed in the U.S.
2.5 million versus what? What was the top?
17,
18, call it 18.
18 million tons.
Jeez. That's
So there's
quite a lot.
6 times as much.
So there is a reason that
Yeah.
the
That's crazy.
Scotch whiskey pulls a lot of material from Ukraine. They pull a lot of Scotch or a lot of their barley from Ukraine. Because keep in mind, 70% goes to animals, 30% is used for brewing. So 30%, and I don't know how much of that malt or that barley Scotland uses versus brewing. So you got
Probably
beer brewing.
very tiny.
Yeah. So that's the thing. You got beer brewing and Scotch whiskey. That could be a 301 topic on barley as well. Like who uses what and where is it all used? That's another layer. But Eastern Europe is a huge source of barley. But again, it grows in Russia. It grows in Turkey. It grows in Argentina. It grows in Denmark. It grows in the United States. It grows in Morocco. I mean, and this list is like 50 countries long. I mean, everybody grows barley.
I mean, I guess the question is, how much is that enough? Are we able to consume all of that? I mean, that's a lot of barley.
we could break it down a little bit further. We don't have that number here, but you could break it down to say, all right, at least what's the difference of 145 million tons? We've got the top 15 countries here, and how much they produce. But I'd be curious to see breaking it down into 2-row versus 6-row.
That would be interesting.
That
yeah.
is,
that's a whole other.
There is a difference. Like in India, the whiskey that they're making now is primarily, is it 6-row?
I don't know.
That's
unusual, but it could, if that's what grows better there, then yeah.
Yeah, so that Indian whiskey we just did, the
Indiri?
yeah, I'm pretty sure that's 6-row whiskey, 6-row
Grab that
barley.
can to see if this is
So yeah, I mean, when you consider like tons per acre, it's not that much different between 2-row and 6-row generally. 6-row is more difficult to handle because it's a smaller kernel. It has more indigestibles. It generally reduces your yield, but that protein could add more mouthfeel if you distill it right. It could add more, flavor components if you distill it right.
I mean, this would be a really cool.
You got to consider that.
Like, I would love to geek out a little bit on this. I know this is probably way crazy, but like, how awesome would it be to do a 401 on this and have an actual person at the distillery talking about this piece of it and just going into like 6-row, 2-row.
I want some 6-row whiskey in front of me and some 2-row whiskey, and I don't know.
This is why it's crap. And it's going in the real world details, because a lot of the stuff we're basically. I mean, let's be honest. It's good information and it's public knowledge, and I think a lot of it is probably factual, but there's still a lot of swag in what we're talking about.
Well. And the thing
real world scenarios.
Does it make enough of a difference for us to even decipher, right? So when you talk about craft brewing, right, like you go into the craft brewing, the beer, there's a ton of nuance, right? These guys are getting into real small details that make a big difference in your flavor. Whereas I don't know if this does as much. I mean, there's so much barrel influence on whiskey.
Correct. That is why, they say that, 40%, 50% of whiskey's flavor is the distillate, but the distillate is broken into the wheat, it's broken into the water, it's broken into the shape of the still, it's broken into the line arm, it's broken into the faints receiver. It's all this kind of things that break into it. So how much of that 40% is the barley? So it gets very nuanced. Now this would be really interesting. So if we can get the guy from Westland who wrote that article on his flavor his flavor preference of different barleys, that would be a great discussion.
I would think that there'd probably be subtle things like flavor notes that you would get out of one strain that you might not get out of another strain.
For sure.
So if you were making a recipe for a specific flavor profile or you had something in mind, I could see that being a thing, but that seems like you're getting awful in the weeds about something. Yeah. And there's a lot of steps in between growing that grain and making the distillate where you could have something like, I made the cut wrong, or, we didn't malt it quite right this time around, or whatever that would affect that and change your end product.
Yeah, it is any distiller will tell you that beer breweries know how to make the beer. I mean, because their beer is their final product. So that's the important part. In a distillery, their beer is just an intermediate. They're going to distill most of the components out of that.
Yeah. Right. So it's not part of tonight's discussion, but it's definitely directly related. How much do you think the yeast plays a part in? Because that's what this whole barley conversation is. It's producing sugar for what? The yeast, right? So the very next step is the yeast to eat all that sugar up.
That's correct. And Four Roses Distillery will tell you that their yeast makes a big difference because they use different varieties.
What does a chemist say?
Well, yes, absolutely it does, because each yeast will produce different of those really unique flavor compounds, like the esters and the aldehydes and things like that are produced from the byproducts of the yeast making the alcohol, they produce other off compounds that create flavor. So absolutely it does. It will.
Did you say formaldehydes?
Aldehydes.
Oh. I was gonna say, damn! I thought that is what they use in fire. and what do they call that? What's that cinnamon whiskey? That
Fireball.
Fireball. Everybody says it's formaldehyde.
Yes, there's no formaldehyde in there.
Paint thinner.
You got to pay extra for that.
All right. So let's see, where were we?
So we obviously took a turn a little bit. Sorry.
We
about
did.
that,
We did.
but
That's
it's okay.
That's fine. I've got topics I want to cover, but we can move around because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about barley in Scotch versus Irish whiskey.
Oh, yeah,
And as part of that, we're going to get
This is
into
gonna be
peated
good.
discussion.
Okay.
So, as you know, technically Scotch can have any kind of grain in it if you want to make grain whiskey. But if you're talking about like their main distillate, single malt whiskey or pot stilled Irish, which are kind of their premium brands, there's a difference in the way they do that. So in Scotch, single malt Scotch is all malted barley. That's the
Right,
rule.
right.
Yep.
Whereas
We
with
covered that
Irish
last week.
whiskey, their single pot stilled whiskey only has to be 30% malted barley. The rest of it can be unmalted barley.
But it still has to be barley.
Yes.
Okay.
So it has to be barley. I believe that's the rule in
Come
pot
on,
still.
just go all malted.
Yeah. Well, but no, there's a reason they don't use malted, and that's what I wanted to look up when I was going through the system. Like, why don't they use malted? In 1800s, the UK put a tax on malted barley.
Of course
in
they
Ireland.
did.
Ah, yes.
The damn
Sons
king.
of guns.
That son of a bitch.
So the Irish were crafty, and they said, well, we don't need it all malted because there's enough enzymes in 30% that we can make great whiskey.
Right.
So they said, all right, well, use unmalted barley. And they just threw it in.
All about the money, man.
It is.
The tax
and
man.
they avoid the tax on 70% of their
Don't blame
malt,
them.
I don't
malted
blame
barley.
them either.
It makes total sense. And you really don't need to. And the thing is, if you look at one of the things that malting does is it does change the flavor profile a little bit if you use malted versus unmalted. The malted barley does have a more nutty kind of and depending on how you dry it, it's smoky or kind of cocoa flavors that can be put into the whiskey. Whereas unmalted is lighter. It's sharp. It's sour fruit, kind of green apple and lemon that you more
I
often
can
see
believe
in an
that.
Irish whiskey.
Sure.
And so it does have an effect on the whiskey produced. But I would admit, probably in the 1850s, they weren't looking for nutty, smoky flavors in their whiskey.
They were just trying to avoid the tax.
Yeah, they were just trying to make
Avoid
whatever
the tax
they could.
man, and it still got you drunk, and it still tasted good because you had enough malted in there to do the work. So you still got
So-
good yield.
Is the tax still in place? Do we
That
know
I don't know.
Because I would be, I mean, if it's not, then they're doing it because that's their flavor
That's
profile.
their
their
profile.
That's
tradition, right.
exactly what it is. I mean,
Yes.
you can
I
get
can't imagine it still.
you can get single malt Irish whiskey. So,
Yeah.
the tax. I don't know if there's a tax on it. I did not look into. That's a good 301 topic.
But that's
as
what
well.
started it.
Yeah, that's
so basically,
exactly what
back
it
in the 1800s, the Irish said, "We know the system's rigged
Man,
because
you're
we
already
use the
taxing our
system."
alcohol. You got to tax the barley too.
Exactly.
Come on,
That's
brother.
exactly right. So it makes sense why they did that.
Arthur,
I love
get in
that.
here.
So
Oh man,
the malted barley, and we did a show on barley years ago.
Long time ago.
Long
Back in
And
the 1800s.
one of the things about malting is you can, as part of the malting process we talked about, you soak the grain, you let it germinate, and then you got to dry it. Immediately dry it so it doesn't go too far. And there are a couple ways to do that. The main way to do it is blow hot air through the grain.
So you
put
blow
on a
dry
malting
it.
floor.
Dry it
You blow,
up.
essentially, you blow dry it. Absolutely.
Right on, man.
And in Scotland, traditionally, you used peat to generate the heat because it was a local energy source. And so you would burn the peat, it would produce heat, and the smoke and everything would flow through the barley, the malted barley, and would flavor the whiskey. But nowadays, peat is more expensive, and a lot of places just
Oh, okay.
use
That makes
natural
more
gas or something like that to produce.
I thought you were
the
saying they
heat.
did it all the time. I'm like, wait, what? Oh, yeah.
Well,
back then they'd had to. That was their main fuel
that was
source.
all they had.
Right.
Yeah, that
Yes.
was why they had it. And,
Right.
and so it was available and they used it. Now, the thing that's interesting about that, and we talked about it last time, is it's kind of like barbecue. So when you start to dry the malt, it only accepts smoke up into a certain moisture percentage. And we talked about that last time. I don't remember what it is. So you can.
It's not very long.
It's not particularly long. So as you still have that wet hull, it'll absorb the smoky flavor until it gets to a certain moisture content, and then it just doesn't absorb it anymore. So you might as well switch to natural gas to finish the drying process because you're wasting your peat. So right now, typically you'll peat for the first so many hours, whatever it takes, and then you convert to another heat energy source.
So explain to me
it.
then the amount of peat versus like peat smokiness levels. Like you're saying that for the most part, there's only a certain time limit the peat can actually influence it.
Yes.
But why is it some distilleries have like go ahead, Mark.
I would say because they mix the amount of peated, malted barley and non-peated
That's part of it, but also you can use a percentage of the heat
in their mash.
How much smoke? When you're smoking barbecue, you only pick up smoke up until a certain temperature of the meat. Right?
It's honestly the first like hour or so.
It doesn't take much, yeah.
So when you barbecue something, and if you think about the whole of that barley being like a piece
Brisket.
of pork, right?
Yeah,
Brisket,
bark.
whatever, right? So you're putting that raw piece of meat in. If it's a commercial smoker, like you only need a couple of pieces of wood. That's it.
Yeah.
It's going to smoke for a couple hours and then it's done, and you're on gas heat on a low flame.
Yep.
So for this, that's what we're talking about.
It's the exact
you're
same
smoking
process.
it for a little bit, and you've got that smoke ring that comes in on a piece of meat,
Or the hull of the
let's
barley.
say an
A half
inch or
inch
so,
or,
whatever. But beyond that, it just looks like normal cooked meat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because that outer hull is dry and
Right.
the smoke can't get in. The
done.
moisture content is what's conveying that inside the
Exactly.
meat or
The
the,
barrier.
or the shell. And once you've dried that out to a certain point, then there's no moisture left to convey the smoke, and you're done.
Well, here's the question, though. Let's just say for the content of this conversation, it's only going to accept the flavor. It's only going to be imparted for an hour, the first hour.
Yep.
Can I influence the amount that it gets in that hour? In other words, I'm really going to freaking pour it on heavy. Like you said, if it's a commercial smoker, I only need a couple pieces of wood. Well, maybe what happens if I put 10 pieces of wood in it?
Well,
What happens if I put 20?
You can cold smoke.
Does that
Yes.
change the...
It does.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
completely different.
And that's exactly what you do. Is you can reduce the airflow rate, you increase the smoke rate, and you just basically
That's what I'm
soak
talking
it.
about.
That
You
makes
just
more sense.
Soak it in
Yeah.
smoke.
So the water can't be the barrier as much because it's cold.
And it doesn't dry
it doesn't
out as
dry
fast.
out. It
Exactly.
doesn't dry out.
So
It
the
just
difference
soaks
being
and
like
soaks and soaks.
locks. When you go get smoked salmon that's cold
Okay.
smoked, and you've got those like
Oh, yeah,
nice
it's-
thin pieces that
yeah.
are like completely dry. That's a cold smoked salmon. Versus a hot smoked salmon, it's just cooked. So it's smoky,
right.
but it breaks up just like a piece of salmon would.
It's flaky.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
I
that
get it, I get it, I get
that- so to my point of the question, you're basically saying the amount of smoky peatiness, in a sense, like, let's just go from like a light peaty
To an octomore.
to an octomore, right?
Right.
That's basically, you're telling me it's probably more closer to a colder smoke, in a sense. Is that
It's
probably what it is?
possible.
Well, so okay, let's go in a craft malting area. Yes, it's probably what they do. But in commercial scale, you produce
They're cranking.
100 ppm malt, and if I want a 70 ppm malt, I mix it with 30% unpeated.
Unpeated malt.
That's
what
exactly
that's
what you were saying.
right.
Which is what you
That's
said
exactly
earlier.
what they do.
Yeah.
That's where I was going
You
with it.
can over smoke. You can't smoke it in a way that each individual grain will hold more smoke.
Right.
But that is not done at a commercial volume.
And
I
if you
don't
think about it, like the salmon example, right? So if you've got cold smoked salmon, you've got locks. That's got a consistent flavor profile throughout the salmon because of the way they cook it.
Yep.
But we're trying to kill that seed before it germinates too much, and the seed starts to eat all the sugar that we want to turn into alcohol. So we don't have a whole lot of time to mess around with that.
Yeah.
That's true.
Oh,
Yeah,
so your
and-
cold
and-
smoke has to be a time limit.
And in
Yep.
a malting floor, time is money.
Time is money.
You want
You're
to turn
right.
that
I
stuff
agree.
over. You want to turn it over. So
Right.
yes, you hit the smoke at it hard until it gets to a certain point. You convert natural gas heat. You dry it all out.
Off
Scoop
we
it
go.
out. Bring the next batch
So
in.
Mark's point's probably more valid on a commercial basis.
Yes, and then you're right. And
Because of the simple fact, if you don't want to leave it on that floor too long, because it'll frickin' germinate.
yeah,
That's
you
what's
got to
gonna
get it dry. You got to get it dry. You want it to germinate and just hit those enzymes up to level
And stop.
because then you convert those sugars into plant material that you brush off anyway.
So, question, chemist, how do you know when it's done? Like, how do you know when it's not too far? Like, maybe physically you can see it, but I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
is there? Do they do? I mean,
They've got the
like
process
barbecue. You
down.
put a meat thermometer in there. But I mean, how do you gauge?
So I can tell you when my father worked he was a grain merchant. So when all these big trucks pull up, it's a sample.
Yep.
Like they're pulling a sample,
Pull
they put a
sample
big
out.
tube down into that truck, and then it's just that's the
Somebody
average
grabs
of that
it, looks,
truck.
and knows what they're doing, and
Yep.
says, "Oh,
they
it's
weigh
done."
it, they check the moisture content of the grain that they pulled out.
Okay.
You know, and they just kind of like it's a quick down and dirty test, and they're like, "Yep,
Fair.
we're good," and they dump it and move on to the next one.
Yeah,
Good.
they've got a
So-
formula on their malting floor that this is, and they know this is the water content coming in. This is how much water I need to do. You go through that. You go through the process of turning it, and then you check it every so many hours to say, is it done? And then you
just
you
to
call it.
set the stage here for everyone's mind, your imagination, your visioning with the conversation, what's going on in that distillery. In reality, the vast majority of these distilleries are getting that delivered.
The
here.
malt. Yeah.
Right,
They're
that's
getting
being
commercial malt.
produced at some commercial malting floor company.
Oh, yeah,
That's
yeah.
what they do.
We all have the romanticized version of the distillery,
We
right?
sure do.
But I mean, it's kind of like when people come into my restaurant and they're like, "Oh my God, it's awesome," and everything's. And for me, it's my workplace, right?
Right.
And the stuff that I do, I'm like, well, I mean, you think it's amazing because you don't do this every day,
Yeah.
right? But I know all the tricks
It's a
in the back
machine.
to
Right.
make this work correctly, and this is how it's going to go. And it's, I'm ordering from commercial purveyors. I'm not going out and selecting my cow
Right.
to turn into steaks, right? Like that's.
I mean, it'd be cool if you were, but let's be realistic.
Occasionally I do,
A real
but not
chef,
very
a real
often.
chef would.
Oh shit!
A real chef doesn't have time.
I know they don't. They're running a kitchen, and the kitchen's
But a real
no joke.
chef makes you believe that that's what
Oh,
they
of course
did.
they
So it's almost a good carpenter. That's what
But I would imagine a commercial malting floor is a lot like a commercial kitchen, or
It is.
even more like an industrial packing plant. Probably is more akin to it. Like they're rolling through stuff, and they've got quotas to hit, and they've got 100 distilleries that they've got to provide grains
Right.
for, and they're just getting it done.
There are some small distilleries that are doing small runs of very craft stuff, of whether it's a very specific barley coming from a very specific farm, and they're drying it, malting it in house, doing that, and putting out small, and that's awesome, right? That's that craftiness,
craft,
and
yeah.
that's incredible. You can get some great whiskeys, or you can get some that are like, whew, this is not what I
How much can
anticipated.
you sell your volume for, though?
Well, but the vast majority of them, especially your Glenlivets of the world, they're
They don't-
buying.
they don't
They're
compromise
putting an
on
order
the-
in, and they're saying we need this
Yeah.
many tons.
I need 4 million tons.
Years
next
of
week.
business tells them this is what we need.
From the ordering side, I would imagine it's a catalog just like I look at,
Oh,
right? And it's
yeah.
got like, hey man, here's your 6 or 8 different varieties of grains that we've got available at the malting house right now. If you need peated, we're doing it at these 1 or 2 levels.
Yep.
We can blend it down to a couple of different levels and let us know where you want us to dump it.
But to your point, I guess Glenlivet, et cetera, if you're using that as an example, that catalog, they know, hey, I need F4. I just give me my normal.
Yeah.
Yep.
They're not even guessing. Like it's on an automatic.
Right.
Automatic.
They've got those orders in a year out.
Oh yeah. I mean,
Because they've got contracts.
Right.
They're like,
People are
hey,
growing it
I
for
need you
them.
to drop off, 10 rail cars a week for us to keep production
Right.
at the level that we need.
yeah,
it to be at.
they buy futures or they buy out. They
forecast
plan
that
out.
shit.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sure.
Because they can't afford to not have it.
Well, I mean, that's like any manufacturing plant. We have contracts that we need so much chemical supply over the next 3 years, and we contract with our suppliers that this is our demand. We will buy this much from you every year if you can guarantee it for us. It's like, all right, and we, whether we use it or not, we have to buy it because we made a contract with them.
Yep.
So same thing.
Right.
So let me help you on the segue here. So we're talking about the history. What are we looking for in the future here? How is barley going to play into our future role?
Space
That-
barley?
Space barley.
Space barley.
Space barley.
So I
like
wish,
Space Jam.
We were talking
Spaceballs.
about certain. There are malting companies that and I thought I put the name of one in here, but I didn't. But anyway, either way, the Malt Barley Committee of the Maltsters Association of Great Britain is currently working on new malt varieties. So this is what the Scotch Whisky Association uses.
What?
They have Scotch Whisky has a list of 10 different types of barley that they recommend for brewing. You're allowed to use others, but these are the ones that's like, we know these are great. We know the yields on them. We know the farmers. We know
They're
farmers.
tested,
They're
basically.
tested. They're well tested. And so what they're doing is that committee is constantly going through new varieties. they're companies and scientists coming up with new strains of barley, and they go through and they're testing them, and they're going through and there's so the current one that's 70% of barley produced is Laureate variety, because it's got a high yield ratio, like 410 liters per ton is what their current rough expectation is. But they have a new one that they're coming out that they've done some work on that produces an extra 5 liters of liquor of alcohol per ton.
That seems like a pretty good step up.
That's a big
Really?
deal.
5 liters?
That's 1%. That's 1% less grain you have to buy.
Okay.
I mean, that's not a joke.
Over the course of think about how much grain
when you're buying a million
You know
tons
who
a
can
year.
appreciate that? Andrew. If
Million
Andrew were
tons.
here, he'd be like, 5 liters is huge.
I can appreciate that.
Yeah, no, the question is, does it cost you 2% more?
Yeah,
You know,
it sounds like
fair
anything else
question.
in the normal world we live
mean-
in. It's going to cost you more for
Yeah.
extra
But
alcohol.
then everybody wins, right? The farmer makes a little bit more money per ton. The distillery gets a little bit more alcohol out
per
of the
ton,
grain
yeah.
that they're
We're paying
buying,
them the
and we
money.
get to pay everybody more.
That's
Exactly.
right.
That's it,
Exactly.
yeah.
So
Yeah, the other thing that this committee is going through is there's something that is produced in fermentation processes that you don't want. So they are going through these strains and verifying that there's actually a gene that they can look at. That there's a all right, I'm going to go through a little bit of scientific terms here.
Oh boy, let me get a drink ready. Go ahead.
Epiheterodendron is a chemical that is produced in the barley. They will take that the yeast will take that chemical and turn it into ethyl carbamate, which is a potential carcinogen. So
Sounds delicious.
Doesn't sound good.
there are lots of barleys that will produce essentially ethyl carbamate when it's fermented. So any variety that the Scotch Whisky Association picks does not produce that. That is one of the you will not be selected by Scotch Whisky Association
If you cause cancer?
if you produce EPH, which is the epiheterodendron.
but is it delicious?
I think it's only ppm quiet. I mean, that's
Do
the
me
thing.
all wrong.
It's not that common.
It's got to be
it's
delicious, though.
not-
There's more flavor
fair,
there.
Fair point.
It's like bacon.
Right?
Yeah.
We all
It's
eat
bad
it.
for you, but damn, it's good.
I'll take another slice.
I mean, is it a big problem, or are they just being overly cautious?
Well,
about this?
there's some word that this is primarily a U.S. California thing.
That's some hogwash,
Oh,
man.
some
Of course,
So-
of course.
Bombs just got dropped.
So if I'm making something for Scotch whiskey that's probably going to go to California, if I don't want to put a label on my whiskey that may cause cancer, it can't produce that.
Everything
So-
has a label that it causes.
Just
cancer,
don't sell
though.
your Scotch in California, and don't put that crap on the label.
Well,
use
see,
paper
so
straws.
you're right. It's a little bit hokey, but that is one of their criteria now. So they just go through it. And the thing about the development of these varieties of barley is they produce them at fairly small scales initially. You know, they do like one field or a backyard and then a field, and then it takes a while to scale it up to produce enough quantity to plant 1,000 acres. So it takes a while to do that. And as part of that process, they do all this testing, but they really can't produce in enough quantity to ferment and distill at any scale to really understand the flavor components before it gets on the list.
So they're really doing it for the mass production side up to like the malting area,
Well-
and not really necessarily caring about like the end product.
Well, it's through the yield of alcohol per ton. I mean, so that's part of it. But they can do that at small scale. They can do a perfect mash and calculate that, but you can't get the flavor components. So there may be a grain that gets out on the market that once you get to commercial scale, they say, yeah, it is producing some off flavors, and so while it still may be on the list, it'll kind of fall down. So there's 10 or 12 on the list now, but one of them is producing 70% of the grain.
So essentially, you're saying this produces a lot of Cheerios, but we can't guarantee you if you can make Honey Nut Cheerios with this.
Correct.
Okay.
Or it may produce skunk flavored Cheerios.
All right.
Smut.
Yeah.
But you'll get a lot of them.
So the flavor, so in that
One thing we learned
development
tonight,
process,
smut.
in development process, the flavor is less important. It's all about the yield. It's all about disease resistance, and it's all about not producing epihedrodendron.
Well, how realistic time frame is this? Like, how far ahead are we? Are you doing it right now?
Oh yeah, they're doing it constantly. They're constantly evaluating. Every year.
When I did the barley for the last one, I mean, it's like 10 years out.
Yeah,
like it takes a long
It takes
time.
several years to produce it, but because they got the genetics, and then they've got to do some stability of the genetics, and they've got to crossbreed and see if it actually grows.
And then they have to actually grow enough to have enough seed so you can plant it at a commercial scale.
Yes,
Right.
that's the big thing, because
Right.
how many crops do you get a year, and you get what 12 kernels per seed?
Well, and if everybody's planting, Golden Promise or whatever, you've got to get people to be comfortable with buying this. Because if they're buying Golden Promise and it produces the result that they like,
and it's consistent,
they may not want to change.
Yeah,
Right.
don't mess
if
with
they don't have to.
what works.
It's a slow conversion, I'll bet.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. So barley is kind of important.
See, this is the thing that's so weird.
Jeez.
Is
A wee bit.
you don't ever think about barley when you buy your bottle of whiskey, but there's a whole world.
It's a
of
whole
barley
world
that needs to be managed
whole
and
new
maintained,
world.
and it's crazy. This little part of whiskey has a whole
All right.
industry.
So we've got fascinating, and I definitely want to leave some time for comments here
Yep.
and some
There's
questions.
time for questions here.
Yeah, we have questions at the top here. They've got some cues in front of them. So, dirty sink mark is what was mentioned for you earlier.
Do you remember which?
I don't know. So Tom Harper said he watched a video 7 years ago.
I remember that. I don't know
I
what
do
Scotch we
remember.
were, but
I don't
remember
remember
you
what Scotch
describing
is.
that.
And I still to this day will have that note on
dirty
certain particular.
sink.
Yes.
Do you remember which whiskey that was?
Yes,
it's
I
7
don't
years
remember what
ago.
whiskey what it, but if I can give you more detail as to what it is. So, you remember like the old porcelain sinks, the kitchen, like your grandmother or great grandmother and I have. They were old, big white porcelain ones.
Mm-hmm.
There was just a smell that my great grandmother, my grandmother I don't know. Maybe it was the piping. It was old lead pipes or something. I don't
Right,
know,
it's
but
possible.
It's the
but you just like
rotten food in the pipes.
probably
And soap and dirt.
Yeah.
Like a dirty sponge.
And dirty
There you go.
sink.
It was
That's
the
what
lead
it was.
combined with the asbestos to insulate it that gave it that unique.
All right, here's one from Tom R. Can Dr. Scotch talk about what period of time humans transition from nomadic tribes to tribes that started to farm and make settlements?
I think the current estimation of that is around 9,000 to 6,000 years ago, depending on who you talk to. Now, if you believe in some things that there were civilizations way before that then got blown up by asteroids and then came back. But the current civilization cycle puts it between 6,000 and 9,000 years ago.
Tom, thank you for not asking about
Tom,
laden swallows.
Yeah.
Uh,
All right.
that's-
Here you get one from
I don't know that.
Michael Hassler. How did you learn to get nosy notes? I just drink Scotch and I have never tried nosing it.
Oh,
You should watch last week's episode.
You knows it no matter what.
yeah.
so you got to go find yourself a flavor wheel. Go on the internet and print out a whiskey tasting flavor wheel.
Yep.
And that will help, because what you use that as your prompt. This is essentially a prompt. I use this as a prompt when I'm nosing whiskey. It has all the flavors. It's got fruity and floral and cereal and
It's
pea.
the best thing ever.
And then it's got all the different. So if you're doing fruity, it could be tropical fruit like guava, a melon, mango, banana, and it gives you a prompt. It's like, does that smell like a banana to me? No, it smells more like seaweed. Okay, so seaweed, that's going to be in this, so you use it as a prompt and you kind of work through it. That's the best way to do it.
And you will start out at the middle of the wheel.
Oh, yeah, you
Like,
will.
it
Yeah.
smells fruity. That
Yeah.
seems good enough. And not every whiskey has really good nose.
Correct.
I mean, sometimes we smell it and we're like, there's not really much there.
Yeah.
Another
Whiskey
tip
note.
is when you really want to get into this and start training your nose, start paying more attention throughout the day, not just when you're drinking whiskey. When you're eating something, we all know what a banana smells like, but next time you eat a banana, take another whiff. It's about training your nose and identifying what you smell.
It's muscle memory for your nose
and
brain.
sooner or later, those things start getting ingrained in your head, and you're like, oh, yeah, that's toast. That's an apple.
And let your brain go free without trying to. I mean, it's easy for some people to do it, but just like boom, and then it comes in Cocoa Pebbles or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
Your
'cause
experience, draw on your personal experiences.
Yeah, because I mean, if you like bite into a Granny Smith and smell it, and then you bite into a Honeycrisp apple and smell it,
they're different.
very different.
They're different.
notes. And that's the way that's interesting to explore that.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, another question from Com. I want you guys to have the actual barley styles in your hands so you can feel, see, smell, and talk to them as you talk to a master distiller. Well, yeah, that would be cool.
Epic. I know
where we can even get.
Well, when
I don't know.
When we toured Deanston, they had some of the barley they use that you could chew on and taste and stuff.
I wonder if it would be
cool.
like, would we even know? Like, I have a feeling it's just like, that's hay. Well, that's hay too. That's hay. You know, it's like, would we really?
I bet you would.
About that.
I bet you would.
You might be surprised.
Really?
I do.
Between barley and, well, but the question is, would you be able to tell between barley and wheat? And an experienced eye would tell you, both of them are stalked with a grain head on top. They look very similar, but clearly they're different varieties, and they don't cross pollinate. So yeah, that's a good.
One
idea.
more from Tom, and that's the last one.
Go ahead.
I wonder how often the reject what is trying to be delivered because the barley is bad or not up to their standards.
Yeah, like so basically you're saying how much, like if they get to going back to Sean's point of catalog ordering, right? And they go, here's your shipment of barley, like, and somebody goes, the milk's gone bad. No, I don't want that.
Well, I mean, again, my dad was a grain merchant. Yep. So, I mean, when that grain comes in from the field, like, the farmers are actually going out in the field and checking the grain before they harvest it.
They have their
to
own
make
dryers.
sure that and they want to make sure that it's hitting the moisture content and stuff before they do it anyway. A lot of it depends on the weather. If it's time to harvest and they've got a couple days and they've got to get it out, they'll get it out. They do have big commercial dryers, so if it's a little too wet, they can try and dry the grain out. But ideally, you just want it to sit out in the field until it's ready to go.
Correct.
You run the harvester through the field. You've got all that grain and it goes straight to somebody like my father who's buying that grain from the farmer and is an intermediary to the people that are end users of that product. And so they're buying it and storing it in large silos where it's, got some humidity control and large fans to make sure that everything is good. And they're just moving that stuff out to the end user.
But if reading Tom's question, if you're talking about some major commercial malter that's delivering to a distillery,
yes,
I would say that the reject rate is probably a lot lower than you think because the quality control at these barley houses, these malting houses, are probably extremely high, and these contracts are written for years out, and it's a rinse and repeat thing to them.
I'll guarantee,
just like what you do at work.
Yeah. So I'm sure every batch of barley has a certificate of analysis that says, okay, this barley will have this starch content, this protein content, this water content.
That's crazy.
The granules be a certain size, and then when it arrives at that distillery, they're going to take a sample and they're going to measure all that.
Yep.
To make sure it's right, because if the starch content is too low, then it's not going to produce the alcohol per ton.
And it's probably written in the contract for that. If it's off by 0.01% or whatever, it means this much money.
Silly question for you then. And obviously, I don't know anything about this type of stuff as far as grains and transportation, but to tag on to that, so I'm going back to I'm envisioning your whole piece. So you sold it, you matched it, it's good, it's in the truck, it's getting transferred to whatever state, whatnot. Is there a life cycle? Like, can it go bad? Can it get to the point where you're
but a lot of it comes down to their moisture, right? Yeah. So as long as you're making sure that you're not getting excess moisture into that grain, it's gonna hold for quite a while.
It's already dry
because it's a stable product. It's a starch. It's just gonna sit there until you're kind of ready to do something with it.
Correct.
So as long as it's coming in and it's not overly moist, and that's what they're checking for. Because they don't want it to start growing mold or anything like that, because then you've got serious issues. So.
Right.
Yep. I know there's a company over by where I work called National Starch, and they get trailer loads of corn in every day, and they convert it to corn starch that they use for like acetaminophen and things like that, and they check all that because they don't want mold going into their cornstarch.
Nope, it's a quality control thing.
Exactly.
So.
Yep.
So that's barley.
That is barley. That's barley 201. Whiskey 201, the evolution and the information of barley.
By the way, if you're looking for barley, you can order it on Amazon.
Oh, yeah.
No.
You sure can.
Seriously?
There you go.
You can.
Give me some golden promise.
So I want to thank everyone for listening today. I enjoyed talking about this. It's a really interesting topic. The beauty of Scotch for Dummies is the questions that the dummies come up with, as well as the questions from viewers. So thank you very much. Anything else we need to wrap up?
Other than, we definitely have more 101, 201, more 01 content type things. And the goal of this series of doing the 101s, the 201s, the 301, whatever that may be, is to go back to basics and really try to dive into what makes whiskey, what makes Scotch. What are the components? What are the things that you need to know when you're beginning and getting started on this? And a lot of you out there are listening to us, have been following us for a long time. This doesn't hurt as a refresher. I guarantee you're going to learn something, because researching the topics, I still learn something. I'm like, well, I'll be damned. And we've been at this for 8 years. So
Smut.
Smut. I'll end on that. Good call.
Awesome show, Dr. Scotch. Appreciate your time.
Dr. Scotch in house.
If you do have a comment and you're watching this on replay, leave it below. We'll try to get to it. If you're listening to the podcast, thank you so much for your support. And we'll see you guys next week on another episode of Scotch for Dummies.
Cheers.
Cheers, guys.
3, 2, 1.